So thank you for coming out. I'm really happy we got a nice day for everyone. So my name is Marie Goulet. I am a school social worker in New Lenox, and I also serve as our lead social worker for the district. So I help coordinate all the social workers. We work a lot on kind of our safety initiatives with our community partners. So I get to do lots of fun, different community presentations, which I love. And then in my off time, I also work in private practice. So I always say I see 9-year-olds through 99-year-olds. So it's pretty fun for me to kind of get to see, the littles all the way up. And there's really not much of a difference in the mental health need depending on the age group. We kind of focus on different things at different phases of life, but ultimately it's pretty consistent through the stages. So today we're just going to spend a little bit of time together, very simply talk about some very common mental health issues, and more importantly, what are some things that we can do to prevent and or deal with those issues. So very interactive. Please feel free to stop me at any time. Say, Marie, stop, I have a question, or ask a question, because it'll be very boring if you're just listening to me talk for an hour-ish. So if you have never in your life felt stress, please raise your hand. No one ever does, right? If you've never felt anxious, depressed, if you've never had trauma, raise your hand. Right? I don't think I believe that, especially in your line of work, sir. Right? So I live with a police officer. I know how you feel all of those things, right? So we're just going to talk a little bit about it today, particularly with Mental Health Awareness Month. We were kind of chatting a little bit earlier that there shouldn't be a month, it's just all of the time. And somehow mental health and physical health kind of got separated, but they shouldn't be, because it's the same. And I promise I won't nerd out too much, but we're going to talk a little bit about the brain. And so it's even more reason why our brain is an organ in our body. We should not be treating it differently health-wise, right? All right, so just an intention for our training, right? I've always put this in here. I think you guys are probably going to be my best group. Usually I do trainings and I have people on their phones. If I'm doing teenagers, they're definitely on their phones. Even adults sometimes are multitasking. So I always ask, particularly when we're speaking about mental health, that you just kind of give yourself permission to be present in the moment, because we don't do a whole lot of that these days. We're usually multitasking and doing many, many things. So when we think about mental health and what that is, we have this super fancy definition that we don't have to read, right? But mental health is essentially how we think, how we feel, how we handle stress, how we relate to others, and how we make decisions, right? So mental health also includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And all of those things get more and more important the older we get, particularly being in community and being around other individuals. So some particular life challenges, and please let me know if I have missed anything important and I will add it, right? We think of kind of things shifting in different phases of life. So in our older years, we look forward to retirement. Some of us are counting down the years, some of us are already there, right? So that is a giant transition in life. We may start losing more loved ones, and we're dealing with grief. We have physical changes and chronic illness, maybe a reduced mobility or reduced independence, sometimes social isolation, and then more medications equals more side effects of medications. So one thing I do like to share about myself here, because sometimes it's like, well, Marie, you're so young. What do you know about anything, right? And this is where I share, I'm really not that young. I just practice really good sunscreen and skincare. I just had my 50th birthday. So I feel like that was a milestone, and I feel now like I can actually speak to some things that are happening now that I'm on the other side of some things. I am also a cancer survivor. So that gave me a first firsthand experience with disease, chronic illness, and facing mortality. So when I had that experience, it really kind of opened my eyes a lot to this population that I've really been missing in my career. And so I thank you for allowing me to come in, and speak to the older, wiser generation, because I learned so much from you, maybe more than I will even teach you. So some common mental health concerns, right? We all hear about depression, anxiety. We hear about grief, but I like to call it compounded grief, because grief can be complicated. Loneliness, some cognitive changes. So we were talking a little bit earlier about kind of that dementia, depression overlap and how some of those symptoms can mirror, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's also barriers to care sometimes, so just different things, some stigma that's going away a little bit more, but it's still prevalent. Culturally, there's still stigma. Societally, there's still stigma. Some of our families think that mental health just isn't a thing and we just need to suck it up and rub some dirt on it, or we're just being babies about things, right? But it's actually biological and chemical. Sometimes people feel like, oh, being down is just a normal part of aging, but it's not. And why would we accept that? We all have the right to have a good quality of life. Sometimes it's hard to discuss emotions, particularly if you did not grow up in a family or in a society that really promoted that. Kids today, that's all they talk about is their emotions, right? But when I grew up, that was not a topic of conversation. You kind of kept things to yourself and you shoved it down and you handled it on your own. So sometimes lack of insurance or lack of access to care, lack of transportation, wait lists, which is part of why I went back into private practice, because there's so many people that need assistance. I kind of felt compelled to help out in the way that I could. And then the biggest one is not knowing where to start. So I'm feeling these things, I'm thinking these things, who do I even talk to, where do I start? So I always recommend just your general practitioner, your doctor. And it's been nice over the last few years, when you go for your checkup, they kind of ask you the screener questions. So instead of just saying, I'm fine, right? That's a really good opportunity to maybe honestly answer some of those questions. So depression and anxiety can look very, very similar to each other. And I want to point out, just because you may be feeling one or maybe all of these things doesn't mean you're clinically depressed, doesn't mean you have a diagnosis of anxiety, right? These are all very normal feelings, but it's when they're persistent over an extended period of time and when they interfere with our daily living, that's when we want to talk to somebody. So things like sad, kind of low mood, loss of interest in things that you used to like to do, changes in sleep, so sleeping too much, maybe not sleeping enough, that's not explained by something else, loss of appetite, fatigue, low energy, worry, increased irritability, physical symptoms, right? I'm like, this sounds like Tuesday to me. But again, it's that if it's happening for a long period of time and you can't quite get yourself out of that. So depression versus dementia, again, because it gets a little trickier to diagnose when we have some other health things going on. So depression is typically, that mental decline is rapid. Did I confuse? No, I didn't. I feel like I messed those up. I apologize. Those first two are reversed. So with depression, mental decline happens slowly. With dementia, it is rapid. I have to fix that on my slide, right? But with depression, the day, you're oriented to the day, the time, the location. You may have some difficulty concentrating. Language and motor skills might be slow because you're a little down, but they're normal. And you notice memory problems and you worry about it, right? Versus dementia, you don't notice it. When you're kind of coming in and out, you're not aware when you're out, right? But when you're in, you're more aware. You have kind of some of those impaired skills, difficulty with short-term memory, and the biggest distinction is really that confusion and disorientation in surroundings that should be familiar to you. So we know, right, there is a link between our brain health and our body health. And we were talking a little earlier, kind of our gut health also, instructs everything that our body does. So in the United States, these are some of the biggest chronic diseases. And it's kind of the chicken or the egg, right? So do we have a chronic disease first and then feel depressed or anxious after that? Or does our depression and anxiety kind of lead to some of these chronic diseases and illnesses? Cats, in the bag on that one, we're not sure, depending on who you talk to, but either way, they're connected. So I promise I won't spend too long on this, but I have to spend just a little bit of time on the brain, right? So you can tell this is where me being a school social worker comes in. So I kind of do a hand model when I'm talking about the brain to kiddos. So I say, like, if you make a fist with your hand and think about this being your brain, we have our upstairs brain, our downstairs brain, and our amygdala right there, right? So our upstairs brain is the part of our brain that is responsible for thinking, reasoning, problem solving, right? This is our logical brain. This is our brain that thinks through things, right? Our downstairs brain is our animal brain, right? So when we think of fight, flight, freeze, that's our stress response, right? And right in here is this little thing called the amygdala, which controls all of it, right? So when our stress response gets activated and we're in that fight, flight, freeze, our upstairs brain, our logical brain, is no longer driving, right? We're not making logical decisions. We're acting on instincts. And when we have mental health issues like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, right? All of those things, our nervous system never quite rests. And so we're always in a stress response, which you can if you're always heightened, always in a stress response, your logical thinking and reasoning is going to be really compromised. Then there's another really fun part of our bodies called our vagus nerve, right? So that's kind of the nerve that runs from the base of our skull all the way through our body. And this is a hack for us to really quickly control our nervous system. So if we are dysregulated, if we're in that fight, flight, freeze, there's a lot of things we can do. We can't think with our logical brains, right? But we can trick our body into feeling more regulated. So doing different things like putting cold on pressure points for our vagus nerve. So right behind our ear is a great access point. And it helps immediately kind of send that message to your brain that, like, hey, you're okay, you need to stop. There's some different sensory input coming in, and it's like a nice little hack to trick our brains a little bit to come back online to be a little bit more rational, right? So I like to explain it, if there's someone drowning, more often than not, the person that's drowning and the person that's going to save them may both end up drowning. And that is because the person that's drowning is not processing information. They are in full panic, full fight mode, and they don't perceive the person coming to them as help, right? And they're flailing around, and they may actually see that person coming to them as danger, right? A really simple way, have you ever been really, really upset about something and someone tells you to calm down? Has that ever in the history of mankind been useful to any of you if you're upset and someone says to calm down? Yeah, usually not, right? Usually that will kind of send us over the edge, right? But when we're upset, we're not taking in all of the information, right? So I'm calm, you tell me to calm down. I think that's so sweet and that's so kind of you that you care about me, right? But if I am activated and dysregulated and I am having a manic episode, or I am severely depressed or having a panic attack from anxiety, I do not have the capacity to think about the intention of words. All right, so we kind of talked about this a little bit. We all know fight, flight, freeze. Those are our basic stress responses. Maybe about 10 years or so ago, fawn kind of showed up. And fawn is kind of our classic trauma response. So anyone that has had maybe a traumatic experience, a traumatic childhood, kind of lives in a chronically unsafe home, they tend to be our people pleasers. They tend to be the ones that don't have boundaries, the ones that are kind of just trying to make everything okay. And they go under the radar a lot because we love those people, right? We love the problem solvers. We love the people that are easy, but sometimes being stuck in that fawn is the most dangerous place to be stuck in out of all of our stress responses. So that kind of leads us to the importance of some things, right? Just being here today, being in community, talking to each other, right? Attending the great workshops like the Matter of Balance workshops and all of the different things, right? Those are all ways to interact. So I think back to the COVID times, right? That we don't really speak about, we don't want to speak about that time anymore, right? But it did so much damage to the development of children, to the older adult population, to the chronically ill population, because it took away community. And I think we're now kind of really seeing the impact that had. And it's significant. We're pack animals as humans. We are meant to be in a community. We are meant to interact with each other. That is how we are wired. So different things you can do, join a community group or a club, volunteering opportunities. I think a really wonderful thing to do if you're an animal lover is to volunteer for the Humane Society, right? Because then you're getting some input and then the animals are benefiting too. Reaching out to friends and family, using technology to connect, and I put that one last because it's kind of like the parentheses on that is that's not a substitution for face-to-face, right? There's energy that's on a cellular level that we give off when we're in person that does not come through a screen. Not to mention if we're only using technology, we don't always know that what we're seeing is true. There's so many risks involved in that, so many scams, so many people that prey on other people. So we want to be kind of careful with that technology. So we kind of think about that fight, flight, freeze and the way that our brains work, especially with mental health. And typically we have kind of two responses to those situations, right? We kind of either go into defense mode, so maybe that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or we have coping skills that we can access, right? How many of you were ever taught coping skills growing up? Right? Did those words even exist or get talked about when they certainly were not used when I was in school? And right, the coping skill was sit in the corner and be quiet. Right, that was the coping skill. Stay out of my way was the coping skill. Right. So we think about kind of the difference of those things, and we want to make sure that we know coping skills prior to really needing them. So I want to put this in here because I feel like at this point we're kind of like doom and gloom and all the things, but like there's really great things about aging, right? You have increased life experience and you can impart wisdom and knowledge to younger people. You are better at emotional regulation, bless you. Even though you didn't explicitly learn it, you are older and wiser and you know how to regulate your emotions, which is a protective factor in decreasing your risk for depression and anxiety, right? Because you kind of know how to handle those things already. You have a unique opportunity to reflect on some meaningful experiences and activities. And later I kind of added in there, things like writing your memoir or, giving your information and your stories to someone else. Those are really powerful ways to connect. So anything I'm missing up here about the positive aspects of being an older generation, what am I missing? What do you guys consider to be something like, yeah, I have this skill that maybe the younger generation hasn't quite mastered yet?
We won't be offended if you answer.
Just the connection to your grandkids.
Yeah, right. So having that ability to now be on the second generation of your families and kind of help, in that way, or maybe do things a little differently or do things the same or teach your children how to raise their children, right? Those are great benefits. All right. So when we kind of talk about those coping strategies, like we use a lot of terms in mental health and a lot of jargon that I really don't love all the time. I think we can just speak in plain language sometimes, right? But a coping skill is just something that makes you feel better, right? It's something that helps you manage. So some very simple things we kind of already talked about, that social connection, right? Staying active and involved. One of the biggest determining factors for anxiety, depression in an older retired population is not having a consistent daily routine, right? So making sure that you're sticking to a routine, right? Getting up at the same time every day, getting some sunlight first thing in the morning, right? I don't have to lecture you guys as much about this, I hope, as I do a lot of my younger crowds. Not getting on our phones first thing in the morning, right? Not having technology be the first thing that hits our eyes. Practicing gratitude, right? Kind of waking up in that morning, having a gratitude practice of like, what are 3 things I'm grateful for, right? Going to bed at night, and instead of replaying all the things that happened during the day, right? Thinking about, okay, I'm leaving that, but what are 3 things I'm grateful for? And I know it's not always easy to do. Maybe sometimes we can only come up with 1, but I promise there's actually scientific research and the neuroscience of how our brains connect when we think positive thoughts versus negative thoughts. Deep breathing exercises. I spend a lot of time in my job teaching people how to breathe. You think our bodies know what to do, and they know how to breathe to keep us alive, but they don't know how to breathe to regulate our nervous system, right? So if everyone kind of places a hand on your chest for a moment, and then like down on your belly for a moment, most of us breathe from up here, right? It's utilitarian. We breathe to get oxygen to live. In order to quiet our nervous system, we have to breathe from down here, right? So there's a huge difference in those shallow breaths versus, right? You can feel it down in your belly, right? And you guys don't need to watch me push my belly out, it's already out. But if I take in a really deep breath and an exhale, you see that difference, right? And getting that oxygen into our blood is what sends those messages to our brain to calm down. So it is the simplest thing in the world to do. It is free, right? So sometimes just taking those big, deep breaths in a moment of anxiety, in a moment of depression, can really make a huge difference. And we'll do a couple specific ones before I let you guys go today. Gentle physical activity, the older we get, sometimes we become a little bit more limited in our mobility. I know my chosen form of exercise is not available to me anymore. My knees do not function the way that they did 10 years ago. So whatever works for you, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Taking a walk around the block is significantly better than not doing anything at all. I love the Matter of Balance classes so much because it really kind of helps you, keep you moving and getting up and teaching you how to do it safely, as any mobility might be limited. We kind of already talked about the pets a little bit. Healthy diet, nutrition, and hydration. We were talking about it a little bit earlier, right? Everything in moderation though. Like, we want the good stuff sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we eat crap all of the time, that's what we're giving our bodies. Our brains are gonna also be impacted by that, right? So prioritizing fiber, protein, right? Those things that our bodies need to be healthy. Limiting intake of news. I cannot express this enough. It's not that you don't want to be informed, but there's so much coming at us from so many angles, and we don't know what's true, what's not true. And right now it seems like the kind of the the overarching theme is divisive, right? Doesn't matter what side you're on. We don't care. We want to divide you, right? But everybody's doing that. So just consuming that all of the time is not healthy for us. We're not meant to take in that much information. It's actually changing the way this younger generation's brains work because they have access to information. They are not making neural connections in their brain that, we can sit on a road trip and look out the window because that's how we grew up and we can be excited to do that. I can contently sit doing nothing, right? That doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's lovely. My 15-year-old son cannot just watch a movie. He's on his phone, right? He can't just be on his phone. He's listening to music, right? We travel every summer and we're trying to hit all the national parks. And I'm doing that, A, because that's what I like to do. I like to be outside. But B, most of our national parks do not have cell service. And it is lovely to be disconnected and have no other option than to look out the window at the beautiful scenery, right? So talking with somebody that you trust is also a big one. Making kind of small, achievable goals throughout the day. A lot of times what happens with anxiety and depression, we're so overwhelmed, our executive functioning, which is the part of our brain that kind of tells us where to start, where to finish, it doesn't work. So doing something very, very small, I tell my clients a lot, just taking a shower, right? It's having that routine, again, that helps keep you going when you're kind of dealing with some of that mental health stuff. We talked about natural light already, hobbies, finding opportunities to laugh. I think just like breathing, laughing is very underrated for the difference that it makes. I do this with the kids I work with a lot. When they come to me and they're just really having a hard time or they're having some anxiety or they're fully having a panic attack, I say it's impossible to feel bad when you're laughing, right? So sometimes even if we just start laughing and fake laughing, it very quickly turns to real laughing, right? So laughter. And then again, just finding some support. So we talked about all of these things already. I kind of mentioned earlier the writing your memoir. I think especially as you age, you have so much knowledge to give. You have expertise in areas. You have things to share, not just with your families, but with the community at large. And it's kind of a project I would love to do someday is to just kind of interview older adults and write a book on there's everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. I feel like we should do something like on the other side of that. All right, so you guys do not have to do this with me if you don't want to, but I encourage you to because when I tell people how to breathe and I show them and we actually do something, it helps stick in a little bit more. So one thing I do a lot with the kiddos I work with is I use our fingers a lot for things, right? So if we kind of take in that nice big inhale, hold it for a moment, we're gonna take our thumb and place it to our forefinger, right? And that nice inhale, we're gonna think about a time when you felt really healthy, right? So maybe it was, I put a hike, because that's mine, cleaning the garage, because I need to do that, right? It could even just be walking around the block, but thinking about a time you felt healthy. So a nice big inhale, just think about that time. Nice slow exhale. Right, and then our next one, we're gonna put our thumb to our middle finger and we're gonna think about a time that we had a loving exchange with someone, right? So we had a conversation with our granddaughter, we talked to our son, right? We talked to a sister, right? Just a nice loving conversation, right? So nice big inhale in, really think about that, exhale out. And this one's a little deeper, right? We're gonna think about one of the most caring gestures we've ever received, right? So a time someone did something for you that just, maybe you were 7 and you still think about it, right? Maybe it was this morning. So nice big inhale, really think about that kind gesture, and then exhale. And then our last one is we're gonna inhale and and think about the most beautiful place you've ever seen. So when we tie our memories and our brains to breathing, it does a few different things. One, it kind of like tricks our brain into those pleasure thoughts, which increases the amount of dopamine and serotonin in our brain, which is what we want to help fight anxiety and depression. The other part of really intentionally thinking about something when we're breathing is that we're staying mindful, right? It's very hard to think about all the things I have to do if I'm thinking about the most beautiful place I've ever been to, right? So it kind of gives us something to focus on when we're doing that breathing. The other thing I like to talk about is what do we do to charge our batteries, right? I've got my phone in my back pocket, and this is panic mode when this little guy here goes from green to red, right? It's instant panic. It's like for me, when my gas tank is on a quarter, it's the same as empty. I need to go to the gas station. I don't like to mess with the empty sign on there, right? So we never want our batteries to kind of get below that point where we have to plug in and recharge. So thinking about like, how can we keep our batteries going so they don't get to that place of needing to be recharged? We talk about decision fatigue a lot, right? On any given day, and the research varies on this. I think the last article I read, and I actually read it wasn't a TikTok, I promise, right? But the last article I read said something like the average person makes like 200 and something decisions every day, right? So from like when you get up in the morning, you know, and that's why that routine is so important of like, what do I have to do today? What am I gonna wear today? What am I gonna have for breakfast? Am I gonna put cream in my coffee? Do I need to get apples? What am I gonna have for dinner, right? All day long, we're thinking about these things, and we don't think about it because it's so much part of our life. But it really takes a toll, particularly if your brains are already kind of predisposed to anxiety, depression, other mental health issues. It's just draining your battery even faster. So kind of having that routine helps eliminate some of those decisions and kind of reduces that fatigue from those decisions, right? A lot of us are addicted to stress. And not intentionally, but again, it's become hardwired into us. We have a hard time sitting and actually resting and relaxing without feeling guilty about it, right? Because if I'm sitting down and I'm charging my battery, if I'm thinking about the fact that I should be cleaning my basement, I could be doing this, I should be doing that, I'm kind of defeating the purpose, and I'm not really unwinding and unplugging, right? So we kind of have a little bit of a stress addiction in our society. A lot of the work I do is talking about what we can control and what we cannot control. And as human beings, we have this very skewed idea that we have control over lots of things. We have control over nothing. I used to think I could control most things in my life, and then cancer told me, nope, you have no control over 98% of the things that happen. But the one thing I have 100% control over is my brain. I have control over what I think. Ultimately, I have control over how I feel, right? Because my brain can be stronger than my emotions if I train it to be that way. So rather than spending all my time on energy and all these things I have no control over, I have kind of learned to channel it into what I can control. So some natural battery chargers are going to be the same as those coping skills, right? For some people, exercise, music. Some people are spiritual, and prayer really charges their battery. Laughing, we talked about. Sunshine, vitamin D, especially where we live. We don't get enough of it. I think 93% of Midwesterners are deficient in vitamin D. And that is also one thing as we get older, we do not process vitamins in the same way. We don't methylate them. So we have to make sure that as much as possible, we're getting them from their original sources, right? So that's diet, that's sun, because we're not processing all of the fake vitamins we take. Sleep, service to other people, complimenting people, right? Sometimes when we're feeling really, really low and depleted, just being kind to someone makes us feel better. I kind of can't help myself when I'm out in public. I can be at Target, the grocery store, it doesn't matter. And I feel like sometimes I have like the therapist label on my forehead. And I just make friends with, everyone. It drives my partner crazy because he just wants to he doesn't really want to interact with people. He, like you guys, he sees people on their worst days all the time, and so he's kind of out of energy. And I'm like, hi, and then within 5 minutes, I've got the life story and, I'm doing quick little shopping line therapy, right? You're like, you too, see, you get it. But it feels good. And especially if somebody is extra crabby and having a really bad day, I like to be extra nice to them. Because I have a little bit of a dark side and it kind of makes me feel good to be nice to people that aren't nice to me. But it does kind of turn their day around sometimes. All right. So we talked about this a little bit already. We've been talking about anxiety and depression a lot. I did just want to include ADHD, though it's not a mental health issue, it is very pervasive and it is becoming more and more common as are autism spectrum disorders. There's a lot of debate on why all of a sudden, where things are coming from. This was not a thing when I was growing up. It's always been around, but we're just understanding how the brain works more now. And then I will, for 1 second, step out of my mental health provider box into my soapbox. Microplastics, right? If anybody watched the documentary on microplastics on Netflix, you will be convinced that everything that is wrong with us right now comes back to plastic. Okay, step back into here. All right. Trauma and PTSD, right? These are relatively new things in the mental health field. We're just kind of starting to understand how post-traumatic stress disorder really impacts our brain. And it is a very, very real thing that we need to be careful about and pay attention to. And this is where it gets really hard for some people to want to talk about stuff, right? Especially if we were kind of raised in the suck it up and deal with it. But it is important to give some of that to somebody else, right? You do not have to carry that around with you because it does not end well. Stress is not a mental health disorder, but it can contribute to mental health disorders, right? We can be anxious without having an anxiety disorder, right? It's a normal, natural part of thinking. And stress and anxiety, depression, all of those things can actually be beneficial if we figure out how to make it work for us, right? Instead of it kind of running the show. So there's a big overlap between stress and anxiety. Stress does not have to equal anxiety, but we often let it go unchecked, and then it can lead to anxiety. So we can be angry, right? That's a natural emotion. We wouldn't have all the emotions that we have if we weren't supposed to have them. But we live in a culture and a society that kind of teaches us we're supposed to be happy all the time, right? Which is super unrealistic. The younger people that I work with and even my younger adult clients do not know how to be uncomfortable. They can't do it. They can't sit with something and be uncomfortable. They can't sit and be bored. Their brains are not equipped for that, right? That is a product of chronic stress and anxiety, right? Sometimes we just have to kind of I don't say this, we have to sit in the shit, right? We just have to, I swear for the public here.
Oh, what is it? Poop urgent, what is that? It said poop urgent? Poop urge?
Poop urge, yeah. So when we have chronic anxiety and stress, right, we kind of talked about that connection with our gut, right? Sometimes we have a lot of somatic systems, so a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches, and sometimes when we're feeling extra anxious, it just releases all those chemicals and you just have to use the washroom immediately. So it's a really interesting thing that happens again with our mind-body connection we don't talk about, but it is all connected. So that can definitely be a part of that chronic anxiety. We talked about this already, right? We tend to try to think our way out of things, but for someone with anxiety, part of their anxiety is that they're overthinking, right? So sometimes we have to get out of our heads. That's why I really like to focus on taking those breaths, but doing it while we're focusing on something else, because otherwise we're breathing and just thinking about all the things we're anxious about, right? It's okay to feel uncomfortable, right? We just talked about that. And language really matters. If we kind of say like, you know, I am stressed out, I am anxious, I am depressed, right? Our words matter. And if that's what we're telling ourselves, we're gonna feel that way even more versus I am feeling like this right now, right? It doesn't mean I am this, it just means that in this moment, this is how I am feeling and it will pass, right? I'm not gonna feel this way forever. Again, we talked about this already. It is okay to be uncomfortable, right? Not so much for this group, but when I do this presentation for adolescents, younger adults, they think every bad thing that ever happened to them is a trauma, right? They think every jerk they've ever come across is a narcissist, right? Every mean thing that someone said to you is bullying you. That is not the case, right? We have a range of emotions. Sometimes people are just jerks. That's okay, right? Sometimes bad things happen. It's okay. It doesn't have to be a traumatic experience when bad things happen. And then again, kind of coming back to that language, every time we say like, well, we're broken, I'm broken, this just destroyed me, this ruined me, this wrecked me, right? Language is so important. Our brains hear what we say and they act accordingly. So what do we do, right? How do we manage stress and anxiety? Very similar to how we were talking about coping skills earlier. But our executive functioning, again, that's why that routine is so important. And when we get out of routine, it is harder to start something if we're doing it differently every day versus like every day my alarm goes off at 5:30, Saturday, Sunday, doesn't matter, get up at the same time every day, because when I don't, my executive functioning is a mess, right? If I sleep in, if I don't do my normal routine, I have trouble getting started on anything productive throughout the day, right? So really sticking with that routine. Learning to say no, right? I feel like now that I'm 50, I am finally mastering the skill that like no, period, is a complete sentence, right? I don't need to justify, I don't need to explain. It's kind of nice. I kind of like it here, right? But learning how to say no to things that drain us so that we can say yes to things that charge our batteries, right? It is not being selfish. I'm sure everyone has heard the oxygen mask analogy, right? You're on a plane, the pilot tells you in the event of an emergency, secure your oxygen mask to yourself first, and then help whoever is sitting next to you, whether it's a child, whether it's your partner, whether it's a stranger, right? Because if you don't do that first, you have a very limited amount of time and you're not gonna be helpful to anybody, right? That is how mental health works. If you are not securing your own oxygen mask, if you are not prioritizing your own needs in thinking that it's being selfish, that if I do this for myself, I'm not doing something for somebody else, it is the opposite. You have got to take care of yourself in order to help anybody else. Thinking about what feeds your soul, right? What makes you happy, what lights you up, and doing more of that. And then we already talked a lot about taking care of your body, but I keep putting it in here because it's so important. Writing, we talked about a little bit. Meditation, and all of these things are not for everyone. So I like to put a lot of things in here, kind of take what resonates with you, leave what doesn't. I cannot meditate to save my life. My brain's too busy. It doesn't work for me. But if I go on a meditative walk, and I have something to focus on, right? So I'm gonna try to count the number of birds I see, right? I'm going to kind of pay attention to what kind of trees there are, right? That's a type of meditation, but for me, I know I need something more active. I can't just sit there and like that will never work for me, right? But for some people, that is fantastic, and that works really well for them. Mindful practice, right? Mindful has kind of been this buzzword for the last 20 years ago. We have to be mindful, we have to practice mindfulness, right? All that mindfulness means is being present right now, right? Anxiety is worrying about things that happened that we have no control over anymore because they happened. Worrying about the future, what's coming. We are not allowing ourselves to be in the present, right? We call it catastrophizing in mental health. The worst thing's gonna happen. This is what's coming. It doesn't serve us, right? But being mindful. So if you're washing the dishes, instead of thinking about all the things, really paying attention to like, what does the water feel like? What's the temperature? Can you smell the dish soap? You know, really paying attention to, you know, like, does scrubbing like sometimes maybe feel really good, or does it make you angry? Like, what's happening in that moment? Again, the more present we are, we're not focusing on all of that other stuff. All right. Progressive muscle relaxation is something that I love to teach anyone that is struggling with anxiety that has sleeping problems, right? We can kind of like keep it together during the day because we have lots of distractions. We've got things going on, right? We're joining community groups, we're eating well, we're going for walks, we're taking deep breaths, we're doing all the things. Then we go to bed and there's nothing to distract us and we're all alone with all the stuff up here, right? So what do we do, right? Insomnia is not an option because if you're not getting sleep, it's gonna exacerbate any mental health issues. So progressive muscle relaxation, again, connects our brains and our bodies. So super simple, laying down, you start with your toes, you tighten them up and tense them up. On an inhale, on an exhale, you let them relax. And you do so on up your whole body, right? Your calves, your knees, your quads, your butt, your stomach, right? Go all the way up, your hands, your arms. And then when you get up here, this is typically where most people kind of carry their stress, right? So really like tensing and tightening up and then really exhaling and letting some of that go. If you do this and get into practice, eventually you won't even make it to your shoulders before you're ready to go to sleep. But it's just, again, another part of our routine. Sleep hygiene is a really big thing and part of the routine. We know, everybody knows we're not supposed to be on screens for 2 hours before bed, but what does everybody do in bed, right? That's when we're like scrolling and on our phones and doing all that. So as much as possible, right, it might not be reasonable to say 2 hours before bed, but certainly 30 minutes before bed. Right? That makes a big difference. Our brains can kind of start decompressing a little bit. Doing that gratitude practice, right? Doing the progressive muscle relaxation. Part of that too is kind of like letting things go, right? Can I control this? Is this going to matter tomorrow, right? Because if it's not going to matter tomorrow, if it's not going to matter next week, why am I giving it so much time and energy right now? Planning ahead, preparing for the next day, the night before, right? So if you are a person that struggles with routines, right, what can you do the night before to set yourself up for success in the morning, right? And sometimes it's putting the coffee in the coffee maker at night so it starts brewing all by itself with this magical timer, right? Moving at least once an hour. Being sedentary does not help us. I chose being a school social worker because I could never imagine having a desk job and sitting all day long. And those kids keep me busy and I love it. I wouldn't have it any other way. But if I have a day where I'm in meetings all day, I can feel it. I can feel the tension. I can feel the stress. And so my little guy goes off every hour that tells me that I have to get up and move, and instantly I feel better. Right? So just making sure you're scheduling movement in if you're not naturally getting it in your day. Talking, right? And eliminating that negative self-talk. We kind of talked about that already with the power of our words, right? So how we talk to ourselves matters. And I talk to my clients a lot about, would you speak like that to somebody that you love? Like, would you ever say that to someone you love, then why in the world do we think it's okay to talk to ourselves that way? I don't get it, right? You should be your biggest hype woman or hype man. Like, you should like tell yourself how awesome you are, because maybe nobody else will, but if you tell yourself that you're lazy, that you're tired, that you're, no good, whatever it is, and you already have those mental health concerns, that's gonna exacerbate it even more. So I just wanted to put this in here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Again, this could be a whole presentation all of its own. We talk about anxiety, we talk about depression, but they're very nuanced things, right? Everyone has anxiety, everyone has depression, everyone does not have clinical depression. Everyone does not have bipolar disorder, right? Everyone does not have chronic anxiety, but there are lots of different levels to these things. Depression is the most common mental disorder in the United States. Not surprising. We live in a country that tells us we're supposed to be happy all the time, but we're not happy. And then we are told that if you just take this pill, it will fix it and it will make you happy, right? Not knocking medication, because that is valid, but medication alone isn't going to do anything if we're not putting all of these other things into practice. So we talked about coping skills, and this is where I have to like be a little bit of a nerd. There's different kinds of coping skills, right? So self-soothing, right? Again, things that make us feel better. Distraction, right? Things that kind of take us out of those thoughts. There's a therapy practice called dialectical behavioral therapy. That's a modality I use a lot in my clinical practice. And the thing opposite action is, right, if I am thinking or feeling one way, but I do something that's opposite to that, my brain is gonna follow my body, right? So if I'm laying in bed and I'm depressed and I can barely move and I just wanna pull the covers over my head, the opposite action to that is getting up and moving, right? And if I can get up and get moving, pretty soon my thoughts are gonna follow along with that and I'm gonna start to feel better. So sometimes doing the opposite of how we feel. Being aware, we talked about mindfulness. And then for those of us that know people that are really truly suffering with a mental health issue, or if you yourselves are, having a crisis plan, right? Knowing what to do on those days that like, I can't just get myself up out of bed and it's getting worse. And now I'm starting to think about things that I won't be able to take back if I do, right? So we wanna make sure that we have a crisis and safety plan in place. So sometimes we talked about kind of with that cold on our vagus nerve kind of tricking our body first before our brain can catch up. We call that somatics and polyvagal theory, right? But we have to do things in our bodies so that our brains can follow. So we talked a lot about breathing, right? Some people, square breathing is literally inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Again, if we put in action to breathing, it makes it a little bit easier to do. Ragdoll, again, if you can, it's literally just kind of folding over, just shaking everything out. And if you can only go here, that's okay. If you can only go here, that's okay, right? But kind of just shaking it out of our body helps. Doing a body scan. So this is a nice thing to do before you do that progressive muscle relaxation. Where do you feel it in your body, right? And then those are the areas we need to pay attention to a little bit more. We talked about mindfulness already. It's good for everything. Again, just being present and mindful is really hard for some people. People with ADHD, right? I have a squirrel brain, right? You're gonna distract me with shiny things and I'm not gonna be able to focus on what I was doing. But if I'm really thinking about something intentional as I'm doing it, if I'm thinking about like, all right, what am I thinking about right now, right? Okay, how am I feeling emotionally about it, right? How does my body feel right now? Again, that's gonna kind of focus me a little bit so that I can figure out what I need to do. Some people really like mantras. I include this in here. They don't work for me, just like meditation, but for some people, mantras really, really work, right? People, again, the importance of language, we can manifest a lot by our thoughts and how we speak. So some people, mantras really work, right? I tell my kids, breathe in, I am calm, breathe out, whatever it is that's stressing you out, right? We talked about screen habits. I will say no more on that other than sometimes taking a vacation from technology, from screens, especially social media, is the best thing you can do for your mental health. Making a to-do list that's not necessarily just all about function, but making a to-do list and scheduling time to do things that bring you joy, right? If our to-do list is like, I have to get my oil changed, I have to go to the grocery store, I have to clean the toilet, right? Can I also add on my to-do list, like, I'm gonna schedule time to walk around the block, right? I'm gonna schedule time to call a friend. I'm gonna schedule time and put it on my to-do list, and it's non-negotiable. If I have to do things that don't bring me joy, I definitely have to do things that charge my battery back up. This is one of my very favorite tools. It is free, you can do it anywhere, right? I explained this once to a group of men that I was working with who up until this point were just like not buying into the whole thing, right? And then I gave the example of, okay, you're in the car, you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, right? And instantly, right? Everybody knows that feeling, that just instant, like, how dare they, right? So you can respond a variety of ways in those moments, right? One way I really like to do is using our 5 senses, right? So you can mix and match, you can do these in any way. You don't have to do 5 things you can see, right? But when we get our senses involved, again, we're focusing on something other than those distracting thoughts, right? So if I'm feeling overwhelmed, if I'm feeling depressed, anxious, angry, whatever it is, dysregulated, I'm gonna look around and think, okay, what are 5 things that I can see right now that are the color blue? Super easy to do, right? We're looking around, we're finding 5 things that are the color blue, right? Now I'm thinking about looking for blue things, right? Then what are 4 things I can feel? Texture, right? I can feel this remote in my hand. I can feel the beads. I can feel the sweat on my neck, right? I can feel my jeans, right? So again, I'm bringing in my senses of things I can feel. What are 3 things I can hear? If I stop talking, thank you. All right, so we could hear the HVAC system. I could hear my bracelets, and then when you moved, thank you, you gave me my 3rd one, right? So we just focus on what are 3 things we can hear, 2 things we can smell, right? Sometimes it's, you know, are you wearing perfume, cologne? Can you smell your shampoo? Can you smell your fabric softener, whatever it is? And then something you like to taste. I won't say something that you can taste because that's not always accessible to us. I like to think of if I could take a bite of like the best thing right now, right? If I could take a bite of like a juicy, perfectly medium burger, you know, what would that taste like, right? We can do this anywhere, anytime. And as we're activating our thoughts, as we're tying it into our senses, it gets very hard for us to think about all those anxious thoughts, all that stress, right? All that depression when we're focused on what we're thinking about. And it's free. I like to include this in here just because it's one of my favorite books. There's Miguel Ruiz is the author. It's called The 4 Agreements. And it's some people, it's a spiritual book for, I find the simplicity in this. There's basic 4 agreements, and to me, this kind of demonstrates mental health at its finest, right? Be impeccable with your word, right? If you know that you have integrity, you're doing things, you know, from a good lens, you're not spending your energy on social media, on drama, on all of that, right? That's gonna also help quiet our brains. We don't take anything personally, right? Someone else's opinion of me is none of my business. That has nothing to do with me, and stress and anxiety are typically tied into what other people think of us, right? Making assumptions also creates a whole lot of stress and anxiety, right? So we don't want to assume anything. We want to actually take the time and get the information and make an educated assumption about something. And then always do your best. And that's going to be different, right? If you're having a depressive episode and you can't get up and clean the house, maybe, again, your best that day is getting up and taking a shower, right? So what is your best that day, and how can you challenge yourself to do your best? So I told you I'm an animal lover. This is my puppy. This is Stevie Nicks. Maybe the best therapist in the whole world, right? She can't talk back. She can't ask me questions I don't want to answer. She just has to listen to me, right? So ideally, everybody has a human version of Stevie Nicks that you can talk to. If not, dogs are actually great to talk to, again, because they can't talk back to you, right? But kind of thinking about, like, who are your support people? Who can you talk to? And then the flip side of that, who can you be a support to? Who can you help out that might need some help? Any questions for me? Any thoughts as we kind of go through this?
Will we be able to get this online?
Yeah, I'll share it and we'll figure out how to give it to you. And we'll do that. So my email's on here. Feel free to email me any questions that come up. And then I also did include some hyperlinks to resources, so just some kind of general community resources, but particularly the National Coalition on Mental Health and Aging and the National Institute on Aging are both phenomenal resources, and they just have so much great information on there. So I will make sure to share the presentation so it can be shared out with all of you as well.
TRIAD works to improve the quality of life for seniors by providing an opportunity for the exchange of information between public safety, social services, and seniors. There are no membership papers to fill out or fees to pay. Everyone is welcome to attend. Each month, we present a guest speaker on subjects that keep you informed and up to date on the latest scams, frauds, and other criminal activities. We also discuss safety issues, home preparedness, and staying healthy. TRIAD meets the fourth Thursday of every month. Contact the New Lenox Police Department at 815-462-6100 for more information.